The following program is brought to you by Caltech.
Hi, thank you, everybody. I think we're about to start the second part of our morning. Our next speaker is Jer Thorpe, and Jer Thorpe has a very interesting background, although he originally studied genetics. You can also see his work in the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan, as well as museums in South America, Europe, Asia. I think his real exploration has really been in science, data, art, but also culture. What does it mean to interact with our data and live with it in these different ways, as well as making that available to a general public? So you'll also have seen his work in The Guardian, Scientific American, The New Yorker, and Popular Science. In fact, his last gig was as the artist in residence, I believe, at the data artist in residence at the New York Times. And since then, he has co-founded the Office for Creative Research, as well as teaching at the New York University's ITP department. And lastly, if that's not enough, Jer is also an ambassador and member of the World Economic Forum, which is a council on design innovation. So I think we're very lucky to have him here. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jer Thorpe.
I arrived really late last night. My flight was supposed to get in at 11:45, but I got in at about 1:30, and waiting for me at the airport was the driver from Caltech, which was really nice to see that he had waited that extra hour. And along with him was another stranded Caltech physics professor who we were going to share a ride home with. And he asked me why I was here, and I said I was here for an event on data visualization. And as soon as I say those words to an academic, I start a counter in my head. In this case, it was about T-2, which is Tufty -2, and which meant that within 2 minutes, I would expect to be referenced to Tufty. And sure enough, the first thing he said was like, "Do you know Tufty?" And I said, "Of course I do." So I went back to my hotel room, and I retooled my presentation a little bit. And my original thought at 2 o'clock in the morning was that I would retitle my talk against Tufty. But then I realized that wasn't quite right. And so I thought maybe across from Tufty. But that felt to me like I was describing the seating arrangement on a bus and not so much about a talk. So I stuck with the original title, but I'm going to come back to Tufty a few times in this talk. About 3 weeks ago, I was one of 5 people interviewed for a PBS feature on data visualization, and Edward Tufty was the first one, and he led off the piece. You can watch it online with a variation of a quote, which I've heard, we've all heard maybe from him a couple of times, which is this: every pixel must be directly. It got scaled down, and so it's a little bit of it's cut off, but it must be directly related to the data. Which is sort of a classic Tuftian quote. I have two reactions to this. The first is, really? Because I have 1,296,000 pixels on my screen. Surely 1 or 2 of them can be doing their own thing on the side. But I also, I realized that quote, which I'd sort of heard many times in different forms, was always slightly familiar to me, and I dug around and tried to figure out what it was triggering in my head. And a few years back, for a project that never happened, I got a little bit immersed in the history of architecture and was specifically interested in this group of architects called functionalists. And I found this quote, which is very, very, very similar to that Tufty quote by Augustus Pugin, who was, among other things, designed the interior of the Westminster Palace. That there should be no features about a building which are not necessary for convenience, construction, or propriety. Which to me strikes me as the kind of 18th century version of what Tufty is saying with data visualization. And I don't want to use that as much more as a historical entry point to how I want to frame this talk. And the late 1800s is an interesting point to start out talking about data visualization, because that's kind of where it all began, more or less. And we've already seen a couple of references in Jeff's talk to some of the data visualization pieces that came out of that time. And probably the two most famous ones that we see when we discuss that region are this one, which is John Snow's cholera map, where he plotted the occurrence of cholera in a particular region of London, and from that map was able to pinpoint the source of the cholera outbreak. And then the second one, which we've already seen from Jeff, are these Florence Nightingale rose charts, which have already been explained, so I won't re-explain them again. I like these two. I see them over and over again at data visualization events, but I've started to think of them as these kind of icons for this difference that I'd like to talk about today, which is a difference in the purpose of data visualization. And let's start with the Florence Nightingale one, because I think this one embodies the purpose that most of us most closely associate with data visualization, which is a purpose of reduction. Let's take a complicated thing and make it simpler for the purposes of communication. And that Tuftian approach is very much about this. About let's take something that is complicated and make it simple in the clearest possible way. The John Snow map, on the other hand, I think embodies the part of the picture which I find most interesting, which is this purpose of revelation. Let's see something that we have never been able to see before. The purpose of it may very well not be about communication. We may not be showing that thing to anybody else but ourselves, but there's an intent to see something in a way that we have never been able to see it, and therefore understand the system better. And when I talk about this to my students, I try to use an analogy outside of data visualization to help understand this a little bit better. But again, the historical period is about the same. And here we can talk about medical diagnostic tools. This is, I have no idea how to pronounce that. It's no, I'm not going to even go for it. It's a blood pressure monitor, and here what happens is that a very complicated system inside of our body, the circulatory system, is reduced to a number, a diagnostic number, a blood pressure number, which can help us make a decision about a person's health. But it doesn't really help us understand what's happening in the circulatory system very well. So it's a very useful tool for the doctor as a diagnostic tool, but not a great tool as a tool for understanding. Right around the same time, the development of the X-ray. And here the X-ray is maybe the very best definition of a revelatory tool. For the first time, we were able to see inside of something that had been closed to us, at least while that person was alive. So we could see things that were happening inside of the body that we weren't aware of. And I would argue that in our discourse around data visualization, particularly in the last few years, we've spent a lot of our time focused on reduction and not so much time focused on revelation. And I would like to spend the next however many minutes that I have showing a few projects that I've been working on and kind of walking through the process that I use to think about how can we harness this process of revelation? How can we discover things and see things that we had never seen before? Hence the amended title of the lecture. A couple of years ago, I was just getting into data visualization and also just getting into Twitter. And after a conversation with a friend of mine who was an epidemiologist, I built this project called Just Landed. And what Just Landed does is it takes everybody who just said, I just landed in London, or I just landed in LA, or I just landed in Hawaii, and it plots their voyage because they just told me where they're going, and I know where they live because they tell me in their profile. So I can put those things together into a system. So we see this emergent system that we hadn't been able to see before from the single tweets that only comes together when we have a few thousand of them. This was done in 2009. I keep on meaning to redo this project, but redoing projects always seems less interesting than doing new ones. So I haven't gotten back to plotting this in the current day. But the idea here was that epidemiologists in particular are always looking for new models to study how people travel, and and I was having a conversation with my friend over a beer, and she was talking about how this was one of the major problems that they were facing. And I just started to use Twitter, and I had these tweets really bugged me. You know, they're these thinly veiled vanity tweets. You know, they're, oh, I just landed in Hawaii, and we were taxiing forever on the runway. So I thought maybe we could use this kind of rich white person tragedy and make something out of it. Something out of it that was interesting, but at the root of it was this kind of moment for me of revelation, of seeing this thing that I had never seen before. And maybe its companion project, which I did the next weekend, speaks to this a little bit more, even though the subject matter is much more simple. This is a project called Good Morning, where I plotted everybody on Twitter saying good morning. So the green dots are people saying good morning very early, and the red ones, West Coast, are people saying good morning very late. And this was just an experiment that I did in a few hours, but this idea of being able to see something that we would have never seen before, like what does it look like for the world to say good morning to each other, was really captivating to me. And that kind of, I think this 2 weeks of exploration really drove a lot of the work that I proceeded to do over the next few years. You know, I always think that I can divide the projects that I do into two categories. There's the ones that I do in an afternoon, like this one, and there are the ones that I do in a year. Like the next one that I want to talk about, which is a project that I did during my 2.5 years at the New York Times, where I was the data artist in residence. For the 30% of you that are asking this question right now, yes, I did give myself that title. And you know, working at the Times is a really great experience. It's a really amazing institution, and they do have a lot of data. You know, I'm hesitant. Martin and I were just talking about this before the break about the term big data. You know, one person's big data is not another person's big data. We thought about the data at the Times as being big, but compared to the things that are being dealt with at JPL and at Caltech, really they're not big at all. But they're very big in another way. There's really interesting cultural resonance in the Times data set, and I was so excited to be able to access that data. So I worked there primarily working on a single project, and I was working with Mark Hansen, who some of you in this room might know. Mark spent many years in LA, where he was a professor of statistics at UCLA. He's now a professor of journalism at Columbia. I think he must be the only person ever who's made the jump from statistics to journalism as far as professorships are concerned. And Mark had been at the New York Times working on sabbatical, and he'd been thinking about a very specific problem, which was how can we model how Times content is shared through what we were calling social space. Everybody at the Times, everybody in this audience knew that it happened. People would share a story to somebody on Twitter, and they would share it, and they would share it, and they would share it, but we had never seen it before. As it turns out, the Times produces about 7,000 pieces of content every month, and each one of these pieces of content generates a fair amount of discussion. And so our goal was, can we create a tool that would allow us to navigate that landscape of conversation so that we could look at every single one of those stories, but not only that, can we look at every single conversation that was built around every single story? And in order to do that, we built an exploratory tool. You know, my practice is very much about building exploratory tools, building things that allow us to not just see one angle or two or 100 angles of a data set, but all of the possible angles on that data set. And this tool is called Cascade. So here's this is about an 8-month-old version of Cascade, but it runs right now in the browser. So this is all running in the browser through WebGL. And I'm going to pause it here in a second so that I can just tell you what's happening a little bit. So on the far left-hand side, this is the first tweet in the conversation. We have time on the y-axis, or on the x-axis, and then in the y-axis, every one of these steps is a degree of separation from the original tweet. So these people follow this account, and so on and so on and so on. So as we get higher, we get further away from the original tweet, and as we get along the x-axis, we get further in time. So this view of the data we call side view, and it just gives us a picture of how far in both dimensions that this story has gone. The pink dots that you see are tweets, and the yellow ones are people going back to read the story. And so you can see already that one of the problems with this is the classic problem of data visualization, which is overplotting. A lot of these things are stacked on top of one another, and overplotting carries a specific problem in this case that we don't get to see the threads of conversation. If two conversations are happening at once, we see them as being together. So we solve that using the third dimension. So this is tree mode you're going to see in a second, where we transition to tree mode so that we can see the threads of conversations that come away from that original tweet. In this case, we can see one big thread of conversation now coming off the right-hand side, a second one which was started by Alyssa Milano right beside it, and then the kind of main thread of conversation. And then using a relatively simple interface, we can skip through and see every piece of that conversation. You know what the exciting part for me was really seeing the structure for the first time. And I call these are architectures of conversation. We get to see something structural about them. And as it turns out, these structures, they have different characters depending on a lot of different factors. So Nick Kristof, who's one of the most popular columnists at times, his tree structures tend to be like sprawling shrubbery. They never get shared too much from one person to the other person over separations in social hierarchy, but they do last for a very long time. His stories tend to be shared for a very long time, whereas political stories tend to look more like this, where there is a very rapid sharing of this. I think this has some social explanation on Twitter. When people are looking to share what they consider to be breaking news, they tend to share it very fast from one another. But if it's been about an hour after that story has started, people stop sharing it because they don't want to appear to be like the person who comes late to the party. Whereas with a Kristof story about arsenic in the chicken or about AIDS in Africa and so on, people tend to share those things more often regardless of how old they consider the content to be. So every story that we see has its own individual structure, and then we can run some analytics on those structures, and we can say, what types of stories lead to specific characters of architectures? And can we learn something about how particular divisions of content are being shared at the times? And you know, for me, this project I wanted to share for you for a couple of reasons. The first is that, and I added this slide after Jeff's answer about 3D, because I always use this phrase when I'm talking with my students, where they're like, what is the best way to show this data in 2D? Yes. Or in 3D? Yes. It's like, yes, and also we're able to show it in one way and then also show it in another. And I was interested to see a follow-up question of that about print publication. How do we take these things and place them in print? I'm sort of lucky, I think, in that 99% of the work that I do is not constrained by print. So I'm always thinking about how can we show the data in one way, but also the other way. And then something we tried to do with Cascade is we did try to show every data point in the system so that we could really see the full character of these conversations. And then something that I don't show in the video is that we have pruning capacity built in so that you can move a slider and prune that thing down into a more simplified structure. And I'm excited about these types of approaches. I've been reading a little bit of work by this late 18th, early 19th century French sociologist named Gabriel Tarde. And he talks about the ability to stop thinking about things as a collective and start to think of them as individuals. And I think about that with data as well. And he's got a couple of really nice quotes which I really like, and about finding the model for disentangling the he's and she's from the they. So in other words, can we look at the individual data points and actually see what that person was saying instead of considering them just to be part of some type of abstract statistical structure. And then my favorite quote of his is this idea of thinking of a society, a group of people as an average group was an artifact of rudimentary statistics. This idea that we back in the 1800s, because measuring capacity wasn't anywhere near what it was before, we were forced to generalize. And now we're not forced to generalize anymore. So perhaps we can get back to a more direct human engagement with the people who make up parts of our data set. And then For me, I've been really interested in the usage of this word visualization. Over the last 5 years, the word visualization, it is a noun, but it's a verbal noun. It contains a verb inside of it, but it has become more of a noun. People are like, can you make me a visualization? And I'm like, no, I can do some visualization and you may get something out of it. But the idea of visualization of a noun I find to be tremendously unsatisfying, because for me, the process of visualization is really the key. So, for example, in the project that I showed you before, I just put together a short sample of some of the screenshots that I took as we were building that project. And you can see that the visual style, the things that we're doing with it, they change drastically over time. And for me, it's this process of visualization that is the most interesting part and the most valuable part. And the way that I think about visualization more about anything is visualization is question farming. Let's use visualization to give ourselves better questions. And eventually we may provide answers for these questions, but if we think about it as question farming rather than answer farming, I think it becomes a little bit more interesting. And for me, most of the projects that I do are driven by some type of personal curiosity. This may be the first time that I actually used this to use the word. I have the advantage of having dropped out of a bachelor's degree 3 years into a 4-year degree, and as such, my connection to academia is as tenuous as possible. And so my inquiries are generally totally self-driven. And for example, 2 years ago, I was fascinated by the original data and discoveries that came out of the Kepler project. This is the first paper that came out of Kepler and after analysis of the first 4 months of the data. I love this paper because I love how many authors are on it. I was really excited to get this paper because I'm a space geek, and it seemed to me just to be so tremendously exciting. So I read the paper, but the thing that was hard for me is that, of course, this paper was made for other astronomers, and as such, the visual language of the paper was in the language of astronomy. So there are people in this room who are getting excited looking at these graphs, but normally your average person is probably not so excited looking at this graph. And so for me, because I really wanted to understand the system, I built a visualization in sort of my style of visualization. So here we see all of the original, actually I think this is the year 2 batch, about 2,300 planets that were discovered by Kepler as if they were rotating around a single star. And here we get a better feeling of what the data actually was, these planets that are orbiting around these distant stars. And then following and also I can sort this by temperature to get a little bit of a look at temperature, and then if I want that to be more readable, I can plot it on a chart, and the visual flourishes that you see here are an artifact of the way that I program. So I program in such a way that when I switch from one mode to another, that animation comes with it. I actually I'm an advocate of the transition, because when I go from this view to the other, I actually get to see how one piece of that system tied to the other. And more importantly, more generally than that, I just understand and am reminded that these are the same data points that I saw in the other view. And so wherever I can, I like to build transitions into the graphics that I'm building, and so this project was one of those one-day projects that I was talking about before, and I did it just to understand the data a little bit better, and immediately I did, because I could see some things that were relatively clear in those graphs that when I came back to them, and as the Kepler planets, especially in this batch, are very close to their star and they're very hot. Those two things are tied together. They tend to be very large, and they tend to be rotating very quickly. This is this little center. This is Earth's orbit, so they're much closer than Earth, and certainly much closer than the further and larger planets in our solar system. So I had this really great experience with this that happens to me often when I publish. So I published this, and a friend of mine who's a science writer asked if he could publish it to accompany a series of articles he was writing on Boing Boing. And when anything gets published on a site like Boing Boing, I have a very similar experience to the airport, which I start doing the T-minus countdown. I'm like, which number of the comment are they going to say that this is breaking every rule that Tufte laid out for us, and it's a terrible visualization? It turns out about 80% of the comments on this particular blog were along those lines, and it was quite disheartening. I really liked this visualization, and I was feeling kind of depressed about it. And then 2 days later, I got an email which had the subject, "Hello, Jer," from the Kepler team. And it was the scientists from the Kepler team who were telling me how much they loved this visualization, and could they put it up on the main page for the Kepler website. And since then, I've always kept that in my head whenever I'm reading online criticism, is that people just generally like to be assholes. and not maybe don't pay as much attention to that as you may be tempted to do. I wanted to use this project as a touchstone, though, to move into a slightly different part of the conversation, but I think threaded into a lot of the things that we've been talking about before, which is to really briefly touch into the pool of interface. Every time I do something in 3 dimensions, Jeff, you probably had this experience before. Martin and Fernanda, you've had this experience before. There's a movie that comes up within like 3 seconds of these discussions. Somebody says Minority Report, and wouldn't that be cool if you could do that with the Minority Report interface? And for a long time, I had to just say, yeah, it would be cool if I could do it in the Minority Report interface. But then I met John Underkoffler, who was the designer of the Minority Report interface, and he has a company in Los Angeles called Oblong, and they make the Minority Report interface. And I spent a week in LA last year, and we took this interface, which you see here, and we built it out to work as a gestural interface. And for me, this was a great opportunity because I came in as an artist in residence, and we came in with this really broad idea, which is let's just push the boundaries here and see what we can do with this type of data. So this is the same concept as the system that you saw before. The difference is that this is now running in this video, because we couldn't film the larger video wall. It's on a 3-screen video wall, but we were also running it on a 5-screen video wall as well. And you're going to see Blake, who's standing in front of the wall in a second here, and he's going to drive the system. And the most exciting thing for me was this thing that I've always been fascinated with, and I've always really wanted, which is data with no interface. I don't want anything on the screen except for the data itself. So this allowed us to really do that. So we wrote a series of gestures that were just specifically for this particular visualization to think about how people might navigate this type of spatial structure. There's a couple of interesting things that came out of this for me. You know, a week was fairly hard for me. I'm not a C++ programmer, and these guys all work in C++, so the first 3 days I was feeling pretty behind, and then the last 4 days we really scrambled on. But you're able to do a few things which I think are quite interesting. The first is the obvious one, which is that you can navigate 3D with a 3D interface. So if I want to move forward, I can move forward. If I want to move back, I can move back. And I actually had this really interesting moment where I was trying to figure out how to zoom out a lot, and I was standing in front of the screen, and so to zoom out, you pull your hand back. And so I was trying this really elaborate gesture where I would close my hand and go like this, right? And John just looked at me like I was an idiot and said, take a step back. I was like, oh, yeah, right. There we go. That's a lot easier. And then the other thing is that, past the gestural interface is this idea of just having more screen real estate. And that allows us to really think about this problem of overplotting. 2,326 planets I couldn't easily put on a laptop screen, but on a video wall you can. And that becomes very, very, very useful to actually be able to work with that data. And one of the things that we don't show in this video, which I found tremendously exhilarating, was that this is a true collaborative interface. Collaborative computing really only happens if 2 people are in different rooms on their computers. If they're on the same room, then one person's the driver and the other one's the jerk, right? It's like the collaboration never really works. But with this system, 2 people can stand next to each other in this, and they can really individually collaborate. This piece that we built is very much a concept car. There are some pieces of it that I like and some pieces of it that I don't like. Here, we're taking data points, moving it onto a different machine, which is completely disconnected from the main system, so that we can create a subset of data that we might be interested in to explore. I was really excited about this experience. I came in to it very skeptical about gestural interface. I'd heard all of the bad things that everybody hears about gestural interface, but as it turned out, it was a really transformative experience, and I expect over the coming years we'll see these types of things to really come into action and to come into play in real life. I started a new company in January with Mark Hansen and Ben Rubin called the Office for Creative Research. And our focus there is to come up with new modes of engagement with data, first of all, but also to consider this boundary between data and culture. And so we've done a few projects, and I want to walk you through a couple of them just as we finish up here. And these ones have a little bit of a different character from what you've seen before. So let me just show you, and then we'll talk about what we're doing. So the first one is this project called And That's the Way It Is, which was initiated by Ben Rubin about 5 years ago, and which we finished last year. It's a permanent installation at the University of Texas in Austin. And so just to give you an idea of scale here, this building is 140 feet wide and 5 stories tall. And the lighting conditions that you see here are basically exactly what it looks like. The projectors are enormously bright, and they're very crisp and clear. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the news, the televised news, and we're extracting entities from the televised news. So this was in the middle of the summer last year. There were droughts happening in Colorado, so dry earths, withering corn, hungry cattle, the worst. And this is one of 6 scenes that run on the building, where we're taking the data that we're extracting from the daily news and presenting it to people in a way where they're able to get a different look at the news content that they would experience if they were watching A, one of these channels on its own, B, a segment of one of those channels on its own on YouTube. So the question was, what would it be like to watch all of the news at once? What type of experience would you have if you could absorb all of the news at once? And this particular scene we call snowfall or snowstorm, because it builds up until the building is almost entirely white and full of text, and then it fades off again. And each one of these scenes runs for about 3 minutes. They run in a cycle, but they're never the same. We're taking live closed caption feed from the news channels, so they're actually changing as the viewer is watching it, and of course they're changing drastically day to day. To give you an idea of what the different scenes look like, I have some stills from the other ones, but I have a bad iPhone video from the scene that we're calling the Cronkite scene, because this one is made up of historical broadcasts from Walter Cronkite. And we're taking the historical broadcasts and we're staggering them by 4 years to the day, so that we match the seasonal cycles, but we also match the political cycles. So when there's an election, there was an election 20 years ago or 28 years ago, or whatever that case may be. And it's really interesting to see with that seasonality. When we were here testing, you can't see it on the video, but there were stories from 28 years ago about droughts in Colorado, because it was the season where you get droughts in Colorado. So we were seeing that being repeated. This is a scene called Bandsaw, where we play the entirety of the news broadcasts. And anytime one news broadcast is coming against another and there's language match, they lock together for a second, and then the second one moves away. It turns out there's a tremendous commonality in language from one newscast to another. And then maybe my favorite and the most simplest scene is that we extract all of the questions from the evening news. So. And we play them all in a 3-minute period. It starts very slow, it goes very fast, and then it always ends with one question, which is my favorite moment of the whole thing. Sometimes it's very poetic. It's like, how could this have happened? And other times it's just hilarious. It's like, did he find his pants? You're like, and that sort of gets us to one of the most amazing things about this project is that was not intended, is that this is a public plaza on the campus, and what's happened over the course of the project is that students will gather, it runs from dusk to midnight in small groups, and they will watch the news together. which to me is really exciting. When I grew up watching the news together with my family, but news is not a collective thing anymore. And Ben Rubin, who's the main artist on this project, talks about when he was a kid and he would ride home in the evening and the houses along the street would all be flickering because everybody would be watching the newscast, the Walter Cronkite newscast at the same time on the street. And so this idea to bring back a common experience of data is very interesting to us. And by putting it into public space is one really direct way of doing that. And then this project embodies something that we think about a lot at the Office for Creative Research, which is a concept that was coined by Franco Moretti called distant reading, which is a technique essentially to understand very complicated bodies of work. It was particularly first applied to literature to say, let's not even bother reading them ourselves. Let's get the machine to read them in sort of algorithmic and computational ways. And he has this famous quote about it, which is to understand literature, we must stop reading books. And his idea is that we cannot understand literature by reading the specific novels, but we have to actually be able to see them from above to engage with them. And I love this quote because it gives us a good bridge into the last project that I want to show, which is the last project that we finished. In this project was installed at the Vancouver Art Gallery for an exhibition about hotels. It turns out there are about 800,000 hotels in the world. This is a plot of about 600,000 of them. There's some interesting things going on here that aren't your standard heat map. The most clear of them is the coastlines being delineated because there are more hotels on coastlines. There are some really nice bright spots where there aren't a lot of people living, like the Caribbean and so on and so on. We can take this data set and we can break it up. We can chop it in many, many different ways. This is separating it by the star level of the hotels. These are process sketches from when we were just working on this to try to figure out what we wanted. One of the problems with such a large data set, though, is that it's almost impossible to get any feeling of character from these type of very, I consider to be quite sterile visualizations of the data. So what we decided is that we would use this as a core and as a framework for moving through this data set. We would look to books, we would look to famous novels. So we use famous novels as a mechanism to travel through this data set. The first one that we use all the time is Lolita. Lolita is a novel that involves a lot of travel, and particularly a lot of travel that moves from motel to motel. So the central conceit in the piece is, what would happen if the characters from Lolita or from insert other fictional piece here were doing their voyage today? What hotels and motels would they stay in? So for Lolita, we're just a little bit time staggered, but we do the same thing for Ulysses, what hotels would the characters from these books stay in? And so the result is this piece that was very much inspired by this drawing by Jack Kerouac, where he was building out the itinerary for On the Road. And we thought, how can we take these types of itineraries and make them a mechanism for exploring a very large and very rich data set? So this is what the piece looks like. I took these photos myself. The lighting is unfortunately terrible. And it's a combination of a map-based data visualization in which these points are following these routes, and then these explorations have a huge database of photographs that we collected and prices of hotels. So I'm gonna play you just a short piece of it here. So we've also combined some video footage that we shot in motels of different activities, hotels and motels that of different activities that happen in those hotels. So these little dots, which are not supposed to behave like that. I just switched to the new version of processing, so there's something going on with my animations. But you'll see in a second that blue dot's going to reach the west coast, and then it will start its path on the Lolita track. You can see the other ones picking up their pieces of the geography as they kind of move on. So here he goes. That's the Lolita point. And so it's following the path from the book. And when it hits the first point, it's going to load a series of hotels that the characters might be able to stay in that city. So we see the names and the prices of these hotels to sort of get a sample of the types of things that are happening in these places. And then during the video transitions, we see, first of all, we see quotes from the piece. And then in the video transition, We see quotes from people who have stayed in those hotels, so their TripAdvisor comments and so on and so on and so on. And so for us, we definitely involve a lot of data visualization, and I was thinking about this as I was invited to come and talk, because although we do involve a lot of data visualization, we think more broadly about our work as being data representation, to think about how we can capitalize in what is the human experience, or investigate what is the human experience of interaction with data. And really, we think a lot about what does data mean in a post-print world. And then to sort of bring it all wholesale, I think my central criticism about Tufte is that the attitudes and the thinking, I think, that comes behind it is really very modernist. There's this idea that we can somehow conquer these complex systems and reduce them into something understandable. So I'm kind of interested in, what does postmodern data look like? What does data look like when we break through some of these fields? And then I don't want to end with a bunch of criticality, because I actually quite like Tufte, and so I'll end with a quote which I really love. They're enormously beautiful visualizations, but it's as a byproduct of the truth and the goodness of the information. It's that phrase in particular that I quite like, the goodness of the information. So maybe the best title for this talk would have been After Tufte. What happens next as we continue our explorations with data, and particularly the considerations with how this big data world, which, as we've been told, is going to be transformational, how is that actually going to affect us, and how is it actually going to affect culture? I would be remiss to end without a shout out to the tool that I use to build everything you saw today, which is processing. It's available at processing.org. I'd be happy to talk to people about processing. We're just right at the edge of a 2.0 release, and there are tons of new data features, some of which are undocumented, which are really exciting and are making it an even better tool for data visualization. And then finally, the reason why I do these talks is to meet people and have good conversation. So please get in touch with me. 2 Twitter addresses, a website. I'm easy to find on the internet, so please get in touch. Thank you. Yeah.
If you want to give some questions, you can come down to the front.
It was a great presentation. I have a question.
Sure.
From a background of psychovisualization, I didn't see anybody talk about using the natural characteristics of the visual reception system in order to cue or get attention that's part of the visualization experience. It sounds more like art rather than engineering. And I'm wondering if there are people that are actually looking at the psychovisualization and the subthreshold filters that are going on in the brain, like Hubble and Wiesel,
Right.
and how do you actually either hide information that people don't need to see or cue information, and how is that being looked at in these designs?
Yeah, thanks. I am primarily an artist, so that's the sort of the main answer to the question. And the second answer to the question is that I consider my work to live very early in the cycle of usability, and I'm primarily concerned with prototyping and research. When I was at the Times, I used to describe what we did as being like those guys at BMW who built the cars that have banana peels. It's a way to prototype possibilities in material research. They might not be ready to drive on the road right now, but they might spark somebody who is in production to say, hey, that's a really good idea, and let's move forward to that. I think that if my weakest part in the understanding of all this is definitely in the areas that you talk about, even though I've done a fair amount of reading in it. My feeling is that as somebody who operates in this space, you can't span all of it. And what I like to do is I like to talk to people like you and to make sure that I can get that information and use it when I need to. So the pieces that I've shown you today have all been prototypes and have all been art projects. We do, as a company, do production pieces. And when we're doing production pieces, the thinking is quite a bit different, although we get hired to push it a little bit. So we tend to push it a little bit. That wasn't a very good answer, but it was a very good question.
In doing your prototypes, have you ever found situations where these transitions and these morphemes that you're adding from one thing to another negatively affect the goodness of the information?
Yeah, we don't do sort of user studies. You know, that's not something that I'm particularly interested in. The only people who tend to have a negative reaction to it are people who are in the visualization field. They'll be like, why is that there? Most other people that I talk to tend to talk about how that was either engaging or useful to be able to see how the data connects from one place to another. The thing about all of that stuff is that, I said this as I was showing it to you, is that stuff is no extra work for me to make happen, and it's also no extra work for me to take away. If I want to switch views from one to the other with no transition, I can do that. And the way that I code is that it's just really, it's a Boolean value. I can say transitions on or transitions off. And if we feel that the transitions are overwhelming, we can turn them off. And there are some contexts where that makes sense. You know, there's a rule that I think about all the time in my work, this thing that I made up, which is the ooh-ah rule. Right? On one side of it, you need to make people go, ooh, they need to be actually intrigued by what you're showing them. And then you want to teach them something. You want them to go, ah. I think in a lot of the cases, the bias of academia is that the ooh is built in because people are neurobiologists and they're already going to be interested in neurobiology. So they'll see that graphic and they don't need to be drawn into it. But the reality is with the general public is the general public needs to be drawn into these things. Otherwise, we're saying if you don't have the pre-built interest in these things, then we don't really care about you. And so in my mind, if you can build a little bit of ooh with no extra work into your graphic, then you're going to attract extra people, and that's not a bad thing. Where it becomes a bad thing is where you lose the ah because of the ooh. You know, I don't think that transitions are obfuscating. I don't think they are. And if they are, then you know, for a particular audience, we can turn them off. But there are, for a lot of people, probably to see that solar system first and to see it turn into a graph, they'll be like, oh, that's really engaging, and now I want to understand what's going on here. So it's all about intent and audience at the end of the day. Who's your audience and what's your intent?
I wanted to ask you about the feeling of being able to use that gigantic space.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it always comes down to the Minority Report, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But so when we have worked in dealing with interaction in visualization, I think the biggest criticism is often that you feel like you have gorilla arms, right? That they're just kind of hanging out there. And I'm wondering if that was an enriching part of the experience for you?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, did it detract? And was the experience really the size of the data and the organization and being able to change the form?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a five-screen video wall that was at the Times when I was there. So working on a large screen was not new to me. I like working on large screens, but that wasn't new to me. The gorilla arms are one of these things that I came into the experience just ready for it. But I was there for a week. I was there probably 16 hours a day. I never, at one point ever in that period, felt, oh, my arm is sore. Never. The thing is that the gestures are not what you're describing. They're rarely like this. They're more like this. They're like I talk. Maybe it's because I gesticulate wildly. So for me, it was like easy. It's like that's what I do all day anyways. So it was fine. You know, we do a couple of motions where you do have to like to put it onto a graph. We use this right, and so. That you have to hold up, but you hold it up for like a second. So that was not a problem. For me, the most incredible thing was that so the way that the system works, and they've open sourced parts of it, is that you use a string language to define the gestures. So if you think about every finger on this hand as being a single string in that signature, and every gesture, finger on that hand being a single string in that gesture, or a single character in that string rather, and depending on which angle you want to put it along the plane, you change that string. So you can define any gesture, and that to me was really exciting. Like, what makes sense the most to me, the one that I liked the most is the simplest one, which is to take the screen and turn it flat. I just do that. And that's a really natural gesture, and it works very well conversationally. I can say, like, well, let's look what happens when it goes like that. Like, it just feels like a really real gesture. I came into it really skeptical, and I came out of it convinced that that's the way that we will be. Some form of that will be the way that we will be interacting with large data sets.
Yeah, you also described it as an experience where you could really be collaborative.
Yeah.
Did you work side by side with someone and say, well, hey, why do the stars look like this? Or
Yeah, so we did a little bit of that. You know, the next step of the project would be to collaborate with astronomers who can say, hey, this is the things that we would really want to show here, and can you prototype the examples of that? But I think that operates on two levels. I think the astronomers are one audience for it, but then there's also when we talked to the people at the Kepler team, the most thing they were excited about the most was it as a tool to communicate to the public or to other people in their team, and so on and so on. So there is that sort of researcher-focused, I want to find utility from this through this interface, but there's also, I've made this amazing discovery, and I want to show you this discovery, and this is a great system in which to show that, whether that's to kids or to the people that you work with in the lab across the hall, or whatever that case may be.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So you've kind of addressed this in previous questions, but a lot of this stuff you showed, it's the first thing that is really eye-catching is just, ooh, it's cool.
Yeah.
And so how do you think, things like this are going to change the general population's understanding of things when you have like intimidating statistics out there? Like, you have anything from economic forecasts to political things to science. How will this change the public conversation, perception, and the culture about it?
Part of it for me is to think about the graph as a form is a really interesting form when you think about how the public react to it. They react to it, I think, in two ways, and the combination is very dangerous. It's first they trust it implicitly, and B, they don't read it, which is kind of scary, right? It's like, here's a graph, okay, but they don't read it. So for me, to try to bake in a little bit more ooh into these things might make somebody actually read the thing. That's one of the really important things. And then second, I think the first time that you see any new thing, we're kind of surprised by it. When we built Cascade at the times, there were a lot of people who would, because it looked so much like, the comment we got most often is like, this is something you would see in a movie, as a fake thing. It kind of, because of the 3D and everything, it kind of looked fake. So it took people a while to realize, oh, this is real data. And I can actually get something out of it. The prototype is changing, and the way that we're working with it has changed. And again, I'll go back to trot out the usual excuse that I use, but I think about innovation as being this elastic process. And you burst out and then you come in. And the further you burst out, the better. And so a lot of the projects that I work on, we're either hired to, or I'm doing my own, we're hired to burst. Let's go as far out as we can go. And then using the things that we've seen, let's come back in. And so we collaborate a lot on projects where we do the first phase, and then another group will do the second phase. And the second phase is much more conservative, and it's deployed with all kinds of concerns in mind that we maybe didn't have. But without us doing that burst, they would never have gotten where they got to. So we're that group that does the burst in most cases.
And what do you think of the use of these tools as a social thing, as to spark conversations, like the installation you had at UT, where you could start public conversations
Sure.
and have a public experience, what do you think the role of that in the future will be?
Well, that's like one of the central things that I'm interested in is bringing data into public space to do exactly that. What it does, first of all, is it removes this like a choice. Which sounds funny. It removes the choice of experiencing data. Like you're in public and you see it, and so you'll see something that you might not have normally clicked on. That's one of the things. And then the second is that public space is a shared space by the nature of the word public. It's something that we experience together. And in that project, it's been quite interesting to see that effect. There are some days where you would want to go to that courtyard and see that piece, the inauguration day. There are other days where you do not want to go to that courtyard and see that piece when tragic events happen. But it's a way for us to bring those things almost forcibly into dialogue. People need to talk about the types of language that are being used in the news and so on and so on and so on because it's there for them to experience it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
You said at the end of your talk that as an artist, you don't try to span the whole space of different kinds of people working in data viz.
Yeah.
I'm curious, since I imagine you've had the opportunity to collaborate with a lot of different other kinds of people in this space, if you've formulated an idea of what particular value different kinds of people bring to collaborations on data viz. Scientists, journalists, statisticians, designers, etc.
That's a huge question
to
sort of get into, but for me, it's for collaboration. It's there's something nice about me collaborating with Golan because we're like we're relatively close to each other on the spectrum. But actually, no offense to Golan, who I like to collaborate with is that person that I kind of think that we're not going to get along that well. Because of our opposing views, because in my experience, that first of all, we're not usually as opposed as we think we are, but also I get exposed to things that I normally wouldn't bring into my practice. The data visualization community is a really broad and super interesting one, and I really do love every part of it. And my biggest thing that I don't like about the data visualization is this manufactured fracturing that happens within it, and I think it's not productive, and there's no really reason to have it. So for me, if I could do something more, it would be to collaborate more with people where I'm forced to maybe do some things that they're really good at, and they're forced to do some of the things that I'm really good at.
Thank you.
Welcome. We're going to take two more?
Whoever's up here, we'll just take the three.
Okay, we can do the last three, and then we'll...
Well, that was a really interesting presentation.
Thanks.
My question is also a big one. What strikes me about data visualization is that it's a very human phenomena. And as there are more ways to convey data, tell a story, multitude of entry points, what do you think about like the push or pull or the balance of finding common practices, language, of research, and balancing that with the kind of unlimited possibilities? Speaking as a future academic, I'm kind of interested. I always find it a hard place to be.
Right.
Kind of balancing the bridge.
I mean, the two short answers, because we don't have very much time, but the human thing is like the thing that I'm most fascinated about. I always try to get back to the definition of data. Data are measurements of something, and measurement is a human act. So we have, and often the something is a human as well. This is a very human thing, and there's biases and everything built into that, which is really important to understand from the top to bottom. Whether you're doing art or whether you're doing science, that's the key most important thing to think about. And then for the second part, Neil Stephenson talks about there are two types of people, right? He calls them hackers and tweakers, where you have like hackers who are really just looking for new territory, and as soon as they've done something, they leave it. And then there's the tweakers who sort of come back and pick that stuff up and really make it exact and perfect and codify it and come up with best practice and so on and so on and so on. Things that you kind of can't have one without the other. And in our world, I think there is a sort of vocal part of it who feel that we should be restraining and codifying and making things into best practice. But I don't think that needs to happen. But at the same time, we need people out there who are doing weird things and crazy things, especially since everything is changing so fast. And the scale of data and the speed of data is changing so fast that without those two things, we can't really operate together.
Thank you.
Welcome. We got two more, yeah.
Hi. In your experience of working with public engagement projects, like projecting things onto architecture and things like that, what are some challenges in maintaining and sustaining these experiences?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the first challenge is that public art is like the worst way to make a living of anything. It's like, first of all, you don't get paid very much, and B, like, if you ever want to do anything by committee, public art, like, there'll be like so many people who are like, they need to get their voice into it. But permanence is something that I think with our type of work is a new question. And we've recently installed 2 permanent pieces, and Ben and Mark, working previously, had installed the 3rd permanent piece of the New York Times. And to think about permanence in digital media is really interesting from a technical problems. Like those projectors needed to go in these incredible weatherproof enclosures, and we had to have the costing for bulb replacement set out for 40 years, and so on and so on and so on. Like there's those things, but there's also the experience question. Like, how can we make this experience feel timeless? And one of the things we wanted to do with the UTA project is, you see a lot of projection mapping where the architecture is sort of, the 3D is combined with the architecture. We looked at that in the beginning, but we thought everyone would look at it and instantly say, 2013, that's when that project was done, right? And so we wanted to do something that would feel like if you saw it 10 years from now, you wouldn't immediately be able to guess what time it was made, which is something that I never think about with my work generally, but we have to think about with permanent pieces, which is, how is this going to last? Thanks. One more.
Okay, last question. So this question probably addresses all speakers. I do research in vision implants for blind people and visually impaired. So my question is, you have presented extremely stunning, visualization styles. Have you given any thought to how to address the challenge to use or to communicate the same information to people who cannot use that particular sense?
Definitely, and like I use this phrase data representation instead of data visualization with with that partly in mind. I teach a class called data representation, and part of what we talk about in the first class is that visualization is kind of limiting to people who have a certain level of ability in sight. And so how can we think about the other things? So sonification is one that we've seen quite a bit about, but there's a lot of other ones that are relatively new, like data in sculptural form with 3D printer and so on and so on. I have students that are working with data in taste and data in temperature so that you can feel like a heat differential to experience something. And so I love the idea that there will be a lot more exploration into those modes for that reason, and also just in general, all of those different senses, they're connected to our brain differently, and they're connected to our memory and connected to our experience differently. And so by playing data back through those modes, we get a different experience than we do. A much different experience than we do through just vision. Good question, though. All right, thanks.